Hello, my name is Robert Paschal, and I'm your instructor for basic airbrush technique. I hold a Master's of Fine Arts in Painting, and I have been doing airbrush work for about 18 years in various realms, fine and commercially orientated. All an airbrush is, and this is what an airbrush is, all an airbrush is a very small, precise spray gun that takes paint from point A to point B without brush strokes. And I'll knock out a little landscape out of found objects I have here in the studio. You get a very nice soft spray with the airbrush. This is an internal mix airbrush, and it gives you a very fine dot pattern. And you can develop various images three-dimensionally or flat. And you can use the airbrush for spraying any type of paint that's available and working on virtually any surface there is. All right, you got a piece of paper towel here I'll use to develop on the line. And just tear up. The airbrush was primarily developed as a tool for photo retouching prior to the turn of the century. And it's now used in a multitude of realms: fine, commercial art, album covers, medical, biological illustration, whatever you would wish. And it's a fairly simple tool to use, although in the past, and when I first started using a brush, there was no real sound information on how to go about it, how to mask, how to do your stenciling, how to keep the airbrush clean and working and everything else. I hope to be able to give that information to you in the series of programs. This brush that I'm using is an internal mix dual action airbrush, and it's a brush that's used in the professional realm. But there are various styles, models of brushes that are available on the market, and I have some set up on my work table. We move over to it. I'll give you some indication as to what they are. Two basic types of brushes that are available today are external mix airbrushes and internal mix airbrush. Now this right here is an external mix airbrush, this brush. Right. What happens with it, and why it's called external mix, is that the air and paint come together outside of the head assembly, over here, outside of the airbrush. And the air sort of blows it around. It gives a fairly coarse spray. It is not used really for high-tech illustration or very slick renderings, but it is an ideal airbrush for hobby and craft orientations, painting model airplanes, working with ceramic glaze, using materials of an extremely high viscosity. The type of external mix airbrush that I have here, and the only type that really exists, is a single action. And that single action, as opposed to the one that I'm using, is a dual action airbrush. The single action refers to the triggering. And what you do with a single action airbrush is just simply press down on the trigger. And a set amount of paint comes out of the tip. Now that amount is adjustable from the front. And as you open up the front, more and more paint will come out. And as you close it down, less and less comes out. Nice little brush, bottom feed. You put the color in the jar in the bottom, plug it in, spray. And use for those hobby and craft orientations. Though in the professional realm of airbrush, you have a series of internal mix airbrushes. And what we have, say, this one is a single action internal mix airbrush as opposed to single action external mix. And what happens with the internal mix airbrush is that the air and paint come together right inside the airbrush, right inside a very confined area, right in that tip. And the air really mixes up the paint, really mixes it up, and when it sprays it out in a very controllable manner. And the dots are extremely fine, and they really mimic the surface of the photograph. This brush, again, is triggered simply by pressing down on the trigger for a set amount of paint to come out. And you adjust it from the back. Now, this is the needle adjusting screw back here, the large one. And as you unscrew the needle from the housing of the airbrush, more and more paint is allowed to come out. And it gives you a broader spray that way, and it gives you more fluid. And as you cut it down closer and closer to the handle, less and less paint comes out, and it gives you a finer line. Now, the line is controlled in conjunction with how much fluid is coming out of the airbrush and how close the tip is to your work. And we'll get into that when I do some other exercises. Though that is a single action internal mix airbrush. In the professional realm, the type of brush that you would use would be a dual action internal mix airbrush. This is one here. This is exactly the same as the one I'm using, only it has a slightly larger jar on it. Dual action internal mix. Internal mix, air and paint come together in the head assembly. The air really mixes up the paint, sprays it out. But the dual action refers to the triggering. And on a dual action brush, you press down on the trigger and nothing comes out but air. It's actually considered in the shut-off position. Nothing comes out but air. And as you pull back on the trigger, as you draw back on the trigger, it allows more and more paint to come out. Now what this does is allow the airbrush artist to change the width of the line, the modulation of the values, and the opaqueness of the paint in a given pass. Right? It's always down and then back. Never back and then down. Now let me do that one more time. It is always down, nothing coming out but air, and then back. Never back and then down. If you pull back on the trigger and then press down, you'll just be guessing as to how much paint's going to come out, and normally more paint will come out than you wish, and you'll have a mistake. Now, what I have in front of me here are 3 different models of the internal mix dual-action airbrush. The one that I'm using on the board and I've just spoken about is a bottom-feed internal mix airbrush. And it has a little jar, several different size jars can be adapted to it, or a color cup, that unplug from the bottom. The brush is innately left or right-handed because it's bottom-fed. I can get into a little bit more of that later. And you can just plug the jar in with your color or cleaning agent for cleaning between color changes. In most cases, an artist would have a series of jars with pre-mixed colors in it, sitting in the studio, and just plug in one to the next. And that type of brush would be used for broad areas, van painting, acrylic on canvas, whatever you would wish. But the basic style of airbrush that is used in commercial art is the dual-action internal mix airbrush that is side-fed. And being side-fed, in this case, this brush is a right-handed brush because the color cup is on the right-hand side. If you were left-handed, you would have it modified and have it coming out on the left-hand side. The color cup is just a small little bowl that holds your paint, and it plugs into the side of the brush. And you can have several of these, as you would with jars. Various colors mixed up ahead of time and put into them. And it is adjustable so you can work flat on the table, if you want to, without the paint falling out onto your work. Or if you wanted to do ceilings, you could do that. Paint it straight up in the air, a little Sistine Chapel here and there with the airbrush. But it is the standard illustrator's airbrush, and quite a nice tool, very fine and very precise. The third model is a dual-action internal mix airbrush, which is gravity-fed. And the paint just goes right into the top, and I can show you there's a little opening here in which the paint goes in. Now this is permanently attached to the airbrush, and it's a little bit more difficult to clean. But it allows the artist to be able to lay the brush right on their work and draw a very fine, exacting line without any interference of color cups or jars. It's a very popular brush in Europe and is becoming more and more popular here in the United States. Well, that's airbrushes, right? They wouldn't call them airbrushes unless they were propelled by airs, otherwise they would call them paintbrushes. And what you have to propel them with can change. We have a series of compressors or compressed gas or propellant cans. This first compressor is a diaphragm compressor. It will propel one airbrush. An airbrush utilizes 1/2 cubic foot of air at 25 pounds pressure. Now, don't let that bother you, all the numbers and the CFM, PSI. Just keep it in the back of your mind, so if you're looking for a compressor or a compatible air source, that you can ask the clerk behind the counter at the art supply store how much CFM, how much PSI the compressor gives. And if it gives less than 1/2 CFM at 25 PSI, it will not propel an airbrush. So this is designed to propel one. It also has a unique feature that it only runs when you depress the trigger of the airbrush. When you press down on the trigger, the compressor comes on. So there's a minimal amount of noise, and it won't disturb you as much working in the studio. Rather quiet for a compressor. This one, the red one, is a piston-operated compressor. It gives a more PSI of air and more CFM, so it will handle 2 airbrushes at the same time. A little bit noisier, not much, but it will handle 2 airbrushes. So if you're working in a studio situation where you have 2 photo retouchers working at the same time, you can have one compressor and propel both of their stations. Now the large blue compressor over here is a 1/2 horsepower piston-operated compressor. It will propel 6 airbrushes at the same time. As a matter of fact, it's the type of compressor I use in my studio because I also use spray guns, and this will propel a spray gun. It's a well-made piece of equipment that is maintenance-free, and as all these are. There's no oil or anything that has to be added to the compressor to keep it running. And it's ideal for classroom situations or large studios. Right? So you have the compressors, but they all make noise. All right? And the type of air source that we're using in these demonstrations is carbonic gas, a compressed gas tank. And in this case, we're using nitrogen, right, as opposed to CO2. And the nitrogen is moisture-free. You can use either nitrogen or CO2 in the compressed gas. There is no noise and there is no moisture. And when I talk about moisture, it can be very disastrous when you're working with airbrush technique, because a lot of materials you work with are not waterproof when they dry. And if that water hits the surface inadvertently coming out of the airbrush, it will destroy it. And that water, the moisture, is developed from the hot air of the compressor cooling off in the storage areas. So the compressors, when you use them, they will have a tendency of developing moisture in your hose, and it has to be trapped out. And what we have here is the moisture trap that does it in your hose, right? And it just fits in there, right? The compressors and the carbonic gas tank are the professional methods of propelling the airbrush. A more hobbyist-oriented method would be propellant cans, little cans of compressed gas that you attach to the airbrush. They run out, they're not refillable. They'll give you about 20 minutes of consistent spraying. Though if you do wake up someday in your studio and you find that you have 20 empty cans on the floor, you pretty much just bought a compressor, so take it into consideration. But ideal to use if you are doing touch-up work in a location where there is no electric for a compressor, or you're just doing one job a month or something like that. So propellant cans. Now for just hooking up the compressor, obviously you need the hose, and a braided hose I prefer. And you attach the large fitting to the compressor and the small fitting to the bottom of the airbrush, and it would just go right in like that and screw on, and you would be all set, right? And you plug the compressor in, you put some paint in the jar or the color cup, press down on the trigger, and you spray. Now I'll go back to my board, and we'll do some exercises to start to indoctrinate you into airbrush technique. Now the airbrush, when sprayed, will give you a rather soft-edged line. Well, before we get into the lines, let's get into just how you pick up the airbrush and how you hold it. We have a good idea with the airbrush is to take it and wrap the hose around your arm. Right? That prevents the hose from dragging onto your work and possibly smudging it or leaving some stains on it, whatever. Right? And when you hold on to the airbrush, right, you hold on to it with these two fingers, if you're right-handed. Reverse the procedure if you're left-handed. And around the arm and on the handle, just on the stem, right, like this. And with this finger, you trigger it and you hold it right here. Maybe if I turn my hand this way, since I'm right-handed, we can see it better. You set it right in here like this. These two fingers on the stem, that one onto the trigger, and when you trigger it, it is down for air and back for paint. Down and then back. So you have your airbrush like this. Aim the airbrush at your work, press down on the trigger, nothing comes out but air, pull back, and paint comes out. And various intensities and thicknesses of line can be achieved. Now if we can see this, we'll try to slow it down. You have to keep your hand moving. Otherwise, you end up with lines that are called barbells. And a barbell is simply the hesitation here and moving over and hesitating at the end of the line. Let me do that one more time. You're starting with the paint coming out, and you run over, and you hesitate again. Right? You don't want to do that. You want to be moving into your work, spray, release, spray, release. All right, now I have just air coming out. Now, you come in, put your paint out, coming out. On, off, on, off. And the paint that you use in the airbrush is normally reduced down or comes pre-reduced, and you have to slowly build it up to an opaqueness to get an exacting line. All right, so you make a pass and you have a little blue on here, and then you make another pass and you have some more blue, and then some more and some more and some more, and you just keep building it up until it comes to the opaqueness you wish. And you want to work that way all the time, because if you make it too dark, there is no way of making it light, not with a transparent medium. All right. The line that you're dealing with is controlled in conjunction with how close you are to your work and how much paint's coming out. So if you're very close to your work and you have very little paint coming out, I think I have a little dried paint on the tip of this brush, and I might as well get into it right away because this is a problem that you'll deal with quite often. And blue is a particularly hard paint to paint with. And you can see that. I don't know if we can get a close-up of that or not, but you can see the dried paint on that tip. All right? Now, to remove it, I just remove it with my fingers for this purpose. But maybe you would want to take a fairly stiff brush and wash it off, and then screw on the paint cap on the tip. Right? You screw that down, make sure it's tight, and then try out the brush. Now see how it sprays nicely. There we go. Now there's that dried paint. All right, now, it's obviously not a good idea to leave the brush setting and let the paint dry because you run into this problem. So, depending on how close you are to the work and how much paint's coming out, you control the width of the line. Very little paint, very close to your work, you get a fine line. Right? Sounds good to me. Close to your work, a lot of paint, and you get a mistake. Now, the mistakes can be utilized. This is called a freak drop, and what it is just putting a lot of paint in one area and then blowing it around with the air from the airbrush. That on a tank of a motorcycle will look pretty good, though in the front of a medical illustration, it would be considered a mistake. All right, so you want to practice controlling the width of the line in conjunction with how close you are to your work and how much paint's coming out. And just practice, go from dot to dot, try to build it up that way. Now, when you get really close to your work or when you're into doing the lines, the barbell effect you want to prevent by on-off triggering. It also can occur when you're in something I call U-turns, and that's just simply when you're spraying along this area, you hesitate around the U-turn and you begin to get these mistakes here again. Right? And you want to prevent that by moving faster into the turn. All right. And it's just a matter of practice. I mean, the airbrush, one of the biggest problems, or one of the ways it's looked at as a tool that is hard to deal with because of the fact that it is mechanical and it can scare people to a certain extent. It is simply an extension of your mind, like a paintbrush. Once you get it comfortable with it and you can handle the airbrush with ease and it becomes second nature. It's just another tool that you can use in your studio for all kinds of applications. It can be very enjoyable. It doesn't have to be frustrating. And the system and systems of stenciling and of painting that we'll be dealing with in these exercises will hopefully allow you to enjoy airbrush technique. Well, I did that little landscape in the beginning, that quick one, and I wish to do it again. And it's just done with found objects, and it's something that you can play around with. To do it, though, I think I'll do it in black first as sort of an underpainting and then spray some color over top of it. So I can just remove my jar of paint, spray it out onto a paper towel, all right, until the blue stops coming out. Then I have a jar in my studio which has some cleaning agent in it. And I can plug it in to the bottom of the airbrush and spray until just the cleaning agent begins to come out. Now, another method of doing that, I'll plug this and spray the remainder, is to have a squeeze bottle like this, all right, and it has a little fitting on the top that'll fit right into the airbrush, and then you can spray it out clean. No problem. All right. Now, I have a jar with some black in it. Yes. Now, when you fill the jars or the color cups with ink or paint or dye, whatever it is that you're using, you don't have to fill them all the way up. Good idea. Never fill them halfway, over halfway up. Because if you do tilt the airbrush when you're working, there might be a tendency of a little leak in the paint dripping onto your work. So you keep it halfway full, and the color cup's the same way, and it prevents those accidents from happening. Now, let me just always test your airbrush out on a separate piece of paper so you can make sure that it's working. It's a good idea to make sure it's working, particularly if you're doing a show. And you can just run around. This is at the top of one of the jars that come with the airbrush, something just laying on my taboret. And I'm just spraying around it, and you can hear that on-off triggering that I'm dealing with. And I'm building it up to an opaqueness. Now, if you begin to see the paint getting wet, that means you're building up too quick, and you want to stop and let it dry. Otherwise, you may have a tendency of getting it blown around into a configuration that you don't wish. But when you remove the color cup, the jar top, what you have is a silhouette. Now, this appears to be maybe a hole in the paper, but you have a hard edge line that gives you a definite shape. And with the system that I use in teaching, it's pretty much a glazing method, a transparent color over top of an opaque. And I can go back into this and render in a gradation that gives me the three-dimensionality of the shape. So let's say I want this to be some sort of celestial shape, and I'll come back into it and spray in. The airbrush will spray a line down to 1/32 of an inch, and I can spray in the gradations that make this object look rounded, right? But I have a very exacting hard edge line, and I also, and if we can possibly get a close-up to this, let me grab my pencil. See that little silhouette, if we can get into this, see that little highlight of white that comes around the crescent. It makes the piece look a little bit more three-dimensional, and it can be easily achieved by just not aiming too close to that hard edge line. Now, I can take a piece of paper towel. Always have a lot of paper towels around the studio because you want to be cleaning out the airbrush and whatever. And I can take it and I can just simply tear a shape. All right, and decide which one you want to use. You have two of them, right? Now, we'll decide to use this one. And I can use it to do some clouds in this landscape. Because the torn piece of paper is extremely soft, I can move it around and develop these images with a minimal amount of work. And we can just, and you can do it quite fast. All right, it's sort of fun. You could do this on a surfboard or on a van or on whatever you want. Now, I think I'd like to put in a little horizon line here. And we'll just spray along the edge of a hard edge of a piece of board. Now, when I want to put color in, I will spray the airbrush out. I will put the cleaning agent through it onto the paper towel. And I will plug in my next color. In this case, we'll put a little blue in. Blue always looks nice. Yes. We have a little clog in the blue here. We'll just get that taken care of. Okay, so I have the blue in. I always test it on my hand periodically. Yeah, it's nice. And we can just glaze it over top of the rest of the rendering. And you want to put a little bit in the foreground, you can. Right. And just spray around. I think we've got a few minutes left here. Let's put in another a color. So I unplug the blue, spray out the remainder. You'll really be amazed at how much paint is left in there. A droplet of paint goes an extremely long ways. There was a rather famous short focus realist painter who indicated that he could do a very large painting in black ink, just a tablespoonful, because of the amount, the very little amount of paint that would go into it. I have the wrong color here. Let's put a little red in there. Put a little warmth in. Get the paint started. And test and spray it in. Now you've got actually several colors going here. The red over the blue, the red and blue over the black, the blue over the black, and whatever you would wish. All right? And you can just model it more, put some more color in, whatever you want. You could come back with more colors if you wish. Right? But that's a pretty basic exercise. Now it's a combination in the hypothesis for the for teaching the airbrushing lies in the fact that once you establish a hard edge line, it's virtually impossible to cover it up. You're working in primarily transparent mediums, paints. Even though a paint may be considered opaque in a natural state, when you thin it down for an airbrush, it is going to be somewhat transparent. So if I do my paintings in my darkest dark, and then glaze over top of spray over top of transparent color, I'm just developing a picture out of the underpainting with the color over top of it. And it's a simple system, and it saves you a lot of time and effort, and you can get satisfactory results. So I would suggest that you practice the line exercises. That's primary right at this point. Learn how to spray the airbrush without getting the barbell effect or the splattering, the freak dropping, get a nice controlled line, and then move into doing the found object landscapes. And tear a piece of paper, move it down. You can really have fun with it. As you move it down, you can get sort of feathery edges working into your work. And then add some other color into it. Become comfortable with the airbrush. Press down on the trigger. Spray it. See what it does. See what it doesn't do. Learn. Look at what you're doing. So it's just a matter of taking your air source, hooking up the hose, taking the hose, hooking it to the airbrush, putting some paint in it, aiming it at the paper, press down on the trigger, pull back, and the paint comes out. Practice, have fun. Thank you.